In 1961, a mild-mannered Yale professor placed an advertisement in a local newspaper. He was looking for volunteers, ordinary people, teachers, postal workers, engineers, salesmen. No special qualifications required. He told them they were participating in a study about learning and memory. That was a lie. What he was actually studying was something far darker, something that would produce results so disturbing that when he published them, a significant portion of the scientific community refused to believe them. Not because the methodology was flawed, because the results were true. And the truth was something nobody wanted to accept about themselves. Stanley Milgram was 27 years old when Adolf Eichmann went on trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann was the Nazi bureaucrat responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust, the trains, the schedules, the industrial coordination of mass murder. And when he finally faced judgment, when the world finally got to see the man behind one of history's most monstrous operations, he was ordinary, disturbingly, incomprehensibly ordinary. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who covered the trial, coined a phrase that has never stopped being relevant: the banality of evil. The observation that the most devastating harm in human history was not carried out by monsters, it was carried out by bureaucrats, by men who followed instructions, by people who, in any other context, would have been unremarkable neighbors. Milgram read Arendt, and he asked the question that she had implied but not tested. Was it something specific about German culture, about authoritarian upbringing, about the particular historical conditions of the Third Reich? Or was the capacity to harm on command not a German trait at all? Was it a human one? The experiment was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its design. A volunteer arrived at the Yale laboratory and was introduced to another participant, a middle-aged, pleasant man who seemed slightly nervous. The volunteer was told they would play the role of teacher. The other man would be the learner. The teacher would ask the learner questions. When the learner got one wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock. Each wrong answer would increase the voltage. The shocks went from 15 volts to 450 volts. The panel was clearly labeled. At 300 volts, the label read, "Intense shock." At 375 volts, "Danger, severe shock." The final switches clustered together at the far end of the panel were labeled simply with 3 letters, XXX. The volunteer sat down. The experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat, stood beside them. The questions began, and the learner began getting answers wrong. But then something strange happened. The learner wasn't a volunteer at all. He was an actor. The shocks weren't real. The entire setup was constructed to answer one question: how far would an ordinary person go if an authority figure told them to continue? At 75 volts, the learner began grunting in discomfort. At 120, he shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150, he demanded to be released. At 270, he screamed. At 300, he stopped responding entirely, which, in an actual electrocution scenario, would suggest he had lost consciousness. The teachers, the real subjects of the experiment, frequently stopped at these moments. They turned to the experimenter and said they didn't want to continue. They expressed concern, distress. They asked if the learner was all right, and the experimenter every time delivered one of 4 scripted responses. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. No threats, no coercion, no consequences for stopping. Just a calm voice in a gray coat saying, keep going. Milgram had predicted that fewer than 1% of participants would deliver the maximum shock. His colleagues predicted similar numbers. When he surveyed psychiatrists, they estimated that perhaps 1 in 1,000 people would reach 450 volts. The actual number was 65%. Nearly 2 out of every 3 ordinary Americans, teachers, engineers, postal workers, salesmen, delivered what they believed to be a potentially lethal shock to a stranger because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required it. This is where everything changed. Because Milgram didn't stop there. He ran the experiment again and again. Over 23 variations. Different settings, different experimenters, different distances between teacher and learner. When he moved the learner into the same room, when the teacher could see the man they were shocking, the compliance rate dropped, but it didn't go to zero. Even when they could see the distress directly in front of them, a significant portion of people kept going. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. Many of the participants who delivered the maximum shock were visibly distressed while doing it. They sweated. They trembled. They pleaded with the experimenter to stop the experiment. They showed every outward sign of a person who did not want to do what they were doing, and then they did it anyway. Because the most chilling finding wasn't about cruelty. It was about something far more insidious. It was about the human capacity to hand moral responsibility to someone else and feel, in that transfer, a kind of unbearable relief. Milgram called it the agentic state, the psychological shift that occurs when a person stops experiencing themselves as a free moral agent and begins experiencing themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. When responsibility is perceived to transfer upward, to the authority, to the institution, to the system, the individual feels simultaneously relieved of guilt and unable to stop. They are, in their own psychological experience, just following orders. That phrase has never sounded the same since Nuremberg. But here's what Milgram's data forces into view. The agentic state is not a German invention. It is not a product of fascism or authoritarian childhood or any specific cultural pathology. It is a feature, a deeply embedded, probably adaptive feature of the social primate brain. The capacity to subordinate individual moral judgment to hierarchical authority is not a malfunction. It is what allowed humans to form armies, build civilizations, coordinate collective action at scales that no purely autonomous collection of individuals could achieve. The same mechanism that built the pyramids built the death camps. The same mechanism that runs every functional institution on Earth is the one that ran Milgram's participants to 450 volts. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 50 years later, when neuroscientists decided to run an updated version of the Milgram paradigm inside a brain scanner. They found that when participants entered the agentic state, when they were following instructions rather than acting autonomously, the neural processing of the victim's pain literally diminished. The brain regions associated with empathy showed reduced activation. They weren't suppressing empathy. The empathy was simply generating less signal. Authority didn't just change behavior, it changed perception. This was never really about Milgram's experiment. It was never really about 1961 or Yale or a man in a gray coat with a scripted set of 4 responses. It is about the systems you inhabit right now, the institutions that organize your life, the hierarchies and corporate, governmental, social, digital, that present you daily with instructions you did not write, toward ends you did not choose, using mechanisms you did not design. And it is about the quiet, comfortable, deeply human tendency to let those systems absorb your moral agency without quite noticing that the transfer has occurred. The Milgram experiment is disturbing not because it reveals that humans are capable of cruelty. History already knew that. It is disturbing because it reveals that humans are capable of cruelty while feeling like victims, while genuinely believing they had no choice, while experiencing themselves in the full sincerity of their subjective reality as decent people trapped in an impossible situation. The road to the worst outcomes in human history was not paved by people who wanted to do evil. It was paved by people who were just following the experiment's requirements, by people who told themselves that someone else was responsible, By people exactly like the ones who sat in that room in 1961. By people exactly like you. By people exactly like me. Milgram spent the rest of his career haunted by what he'd found, not by the data, by what the data meant, by the implication that the careful, moral reasoning we use to construct our self-image, the story we tell about the kind of person we are, and the things we would and would not do, might be almost entirely irrelevant when an authority structure tells us something different. He wrote near the end of his life that the fundamental lesson of his experiment was not about obedience. It was about the importance, the urgent, non-negotiable importance of remaining conscious, of noticing when the agentic state has begun, when responsibility has quietly migrated upward, when the voice saying continue is external and the voice saying stop is yours, of understanding that the distance between an ordinary person and an instrument of harm is not a matter of character. It is a matter of attention. The question Milgram left us with is not whether you would have stopped. The question is whether you are awake enough right now, in the systems you actually inhabit, to notice when someone in a gray coat is asking you to keep going, and whether you have the rarest of all human capacities, the willingness to stand up, push back the chair, and say, Isma, no, not one more volt.